Om Namah Shri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Swamine Tapaharini. We bow down to the King of all yogis, Swami Vivekananda, the son of the bliss of discernment, the embodiment of Satchitananda, existence, consciousness, and bliss, the remover of all afflictions. Good morning, everyone. On this Super Bowl Sunday, I'm glad that our talk is not competing with the Super Bowl. Otherwise, I wouldn't see many faces in the audience today. Actually, this light would be useful if possible. Thank you. So today's Sunday talk is a little bit different from the usual Sunday talk. Part of the reason is that the talk is going to be based on a book of mine that was published recently called Swami Vivekananda's Vedāntic Cosmopolitanism. And the book is an academic study of Swami Vivekananda's philosophy. So in the book, I'm making the case that Swami Vivekananda should be taken seriously as an original philosophical thinker. And this hasn't really been done before. Usually people treat him as a saint and as a mystic, as a yogi, or they look at him from a historical perspective, how he influenced the West by bringing in Vedanta, or they look at his sort of the psychological side of his personality. And even when they discuss his philosophy, usually they see him as a kind of modern-day exponent of Shankaracharya's school of Advaita Vedanta. But even in that case, they're not willing to grant too much originality to him. They're saying that, he's basically saying what Shankara already taught in the 8th century, but sort of retrofitted to modern times. But in my 10-chapter book, I try to explain in detail how he's really presenting very, very new, radically new and really provocative philosophical ideas and arguments. So this talk is going to be based on chapters 4 through 6 of my book. They concern Swami Vivekananda's philosophical views on spiritual experience. We're all here because we're all spiritual aspirants. We're sadhakas, we're sadhikas. And we all believe that through spiritual practice, through God's grace, that we will attain the goal of life. What's the goal of life? God realization. Swami Vidyanandaji is very good at matching the opening music with the topic of the lecture. So today, the refrain was, realize God, that is the goal of life, right? So that we all feel that as spiritual aspirants, that's the goal of life. But I'm sure every single one of you also knows people in your life. They could be family members, they could be colleagues, they could be friends, who look on you a little bit askance and think, well, it's nice. He or she is a nice person, but kind of weird beliefs. He or she is out there, or, this person's smart in other ways, but for some reason they can't get over this God thing. At least I know many people like that, and growing up, and there are a lot of skeptics that we encounter. And a lot of these people, what they're skeptical of, they say, well, it's all well and good to believe that God exists, that the soul exists, but how do you know that God exists? How do you know that we're eternal souls separate from the body-mind complex? The answer that most of us would give as Vedantins is that, well, because they're illumined saints and sages throughout the world, like Jesus and Buddha and Ramakrishna and Vivekananda, who have said that they've directly perceived God and directly perceived their souls. That's at least a typical response from a typical Vedantin. But again, the skeptic has their answer ready. What will they say? They'll say something like, but why should we believe that those are genuine spiritual experiences? What if it was just a subjective hallucination? Even if I myself have had a spiritual experience, and I say on the basis of my own experience, I believe in God because I've realized God, they'll say, well, how do you know you weren't just fantasizing about God? That it wasn't just a temporary state of emotion? These are very common questions that come up. And the other thing is to keep in mind, these questions don't just come up from skeptics, as I said, friends, colleagues, family members. Every sincere spiritual aspirant will face doubts at some point in their spiritual practice. If we look at the lives of even Sri Ramakrishna himself, very interestingly, during his period of spiritual practice, he was praying to Kali in Dakshineshwar. There's a beautiful image of Kali there, intensely praying and engaging in spiritual practices. And at one point, he was so desperate for her vision. He said, Ram Prasad, the great saint, singer-saint Ram Prasad, says that you're real. All of his songs attest to the fact that you're real, and yet why are you not revealing yourself to me? Are you made of stone? Are you just made of stone, or are you a living reality? Somebody of Sri Ramakrishna's caliber is having doubts, so who are we? Every single one of us faces these kinds of doubts once in a while. And at those moments, how do we handle those doubts? How do we allay those doubts? So I hope that even though this talk is going to be a little bit philosophical, that there is a relevance to there's a practical relevance for our spiritual lives. Because these are doubts that all of us will face. In fact, our scriptures, Bhagavad Gita, Upanishads, they say that all doubts are not removed until we attain the highest goal of life, which is spiritual realization of God or the soul. Until then, some doubts will remain. Samshaya is a Sanskrit term. It's only final illumination that completely eradicates all samshaya, all doubts. So now, what I argue in detail in chapters 4 through 6 of my book is that Swami Vivekananda has some very profound things to say about why we should take spiritual experience as a genuine source of knowledge. Why is this relevant? Because there are many, many scholars who have taken Swami Vivekananda to task on this very issue. Who are these scholars? I'll mention just two of them. C. Mackenzie Brown is one of them. They're both still living and active. C. Mackenzie Brown says the following. He says, this is from a book published in 2012. For Vivekananda, personal experiences of sages like Kapila are accepted as infallible without critical assessment of such experiences, without awareness that experiences are largely inseparable from personal and cultural interpretation. What is Brown saying here? He's saying, well, Swami Vivekananda, throughout his lectures, his writings, he's talking again and again about spiritual experience. Vivekananda doesn't usually use the word mystical experience, which is very common these days, but he uses words like supersensuous perception, spiritual experience, realization, all the time. His work is full of it. And what these scholars are saying is that, well, he's talking about spiritual experience, but does he ever justify his use of these terms? Does he ever defend spiritual experience as a genuine source of knowledge? Anantanand Rambachan is another scholar who has made a very similar criticism of Swami Vivekananda's views on spiritual experience. He wrote a book, an entire book, in 1994 called The Limits of Scripture, Vivekananda's Reinterpretation of the Vedas. And the entire book is a critique of Swami Vivekananda's philosophical views. A thoughtful one. This is not easy to dismiss, like Kripal's book, Kali's Child, on Sri Ramakrishna. This is a sophisticated, rigorous, scholarly critique of Swami Vivekananda's philosophical views. And up till now, I'm not aware of any monk or any scholar who has tried to defend Swami Vivekananda against the criticisms leveled by Rambachan. I want to focus today, and I discuss his critique in detail in my book, but I want to focus today on chapter 4 of Rambachan's book and his criticisms there, because this is where he criticizes Swamiji for conceiving religion as a science. If you study the complete works, you'll find that Swami Vivekananda, in many, many places, talks about the science of religion. A very loaded term. And Rambachan says he doesn't give good justification for thinking of religion as a science among other sciences. What did Swamiji say? The reason why Swami Vivekananda understood religion as a science, he says that, well, look, what about the ordinary sciences like chemistry and biology and those kinds of things? What is it based on? It's based on empirical verification, right? And he's saying religion is a science in exactly that sense. You can empirically verify the claims of religion, whether we have an eternal soul, whether there's a loving God. How? Through direct experience. And so he says there's a deep parallel between religion and natural sciences, which justifies us in thinking of religion as a kind of science. Rambachan, of course, was aware of this, but he says, great, but how do we know that spiritual experience is even possible? How do we know that it's not just a hallucination? This is his main criticism of Swamiji's understanding of religion as a science. And I want to explore today how we can defend Swami Vivekananda against this very important critique that I think all of us as spiritual aspirants and as devotees of Swami Vivekananda should think about deeply. So before we get into Swami Vivekananda's views on this issue, I want to put his views in a broader historical context. So I'm going to start, I have a few slides. So we're going to start the projector soon. So some context. First of all, the reason why my book is called Swami Vivekananda's Vedāntic Cosmopolitanism is that he was a global thinker. He lived in the US for a number of years, in many countries in Europe as well. And of course, he grew up in India. And so he had this very global outlook. And he was very, very aware of the latest Western thought currents. He was aware of Darwin's theory of evolution. He was aware of T.H. Huxley, Thomas Henry Huxley. He refers to Huxley in a number of places in the complete works. Let me... One second, sorry. I hope that... Okay. All right, so we'll just let it kick in. So he mentions T.H. Huxley in a number of places in complete works. Who was Thomas Henry Huxley? He was a great scientist, biologist. He was referred to as Darwin's bulldog. He was very famous in his time, in the late 19th century. And he was considered Darwin's bulldog. Why? Because he was a staunch proponent of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. And he felt that Darwin's theory of evolution basically debunked the claims of religion, traditional religions. And he wrote a lot on this. He debated with religious thinkers at this time on these issues. Many of you might be aware of a contemporary scientist named Richard Dawkins. Have you heard of Richard Dawkins? He's a famous biologist at Oxford University, and he's like a kind of modern-day T.H. Huxley. He's written a book called The God Delusion, and he argues that it's not reasonable to believe in God because Darwin's theory of evolution has kind of debunked the existence of God. We don't need to believe in God to understand how things have evolved. So Huxley was a kind of 19th century Richard Dawkins, and Swami Vivekananda was well aware of his critique of religion, but I wanted to mention one particular essay that Huxley wrote, published in 1889, called The Value of Witness to the Miraculous, because it's especially relevant here. It's published in the Harvard Theological Review, I believe. This essay is about George Fox, who was one of the great founders of Quakerism, the Quaker sect of Christianity. And George Fox often talked about having visions of God, speaking to God, hearing the voice of God. And Huxley, as a skeptic, is basically saying that, arguing that we should not accept Fox's testimony, his mystical testimony. So I want to quote one part of this essay. Huxley says, "It needs no long study of Fox's writings, however, to arrive at the conviction that the distinction between subjective and objective verities had not the same place in his mind as it has in that of an ordinary mortal." He's being sarcastic here. Most people know the difference between a subjective hallucination and an objective experience. I know when I'm seeing an actual wall and when I'm hallucinating something because I've ingested drugs or something like that. He's saying, unfortunately, people like George Fox don't have that innate ability. And George Fox and other people like him systematically mistake subjective experiences for objective ones. This is Huxley's main criticism. Not only of George Fox, but of any mystics, any great spiritual saints and sages who claim that they have experienced anything supersensuous, anything beyond the senses, whether that's God or nirvana or the soul. Now, Swami Vivekananda was aware of this critique, and he tried to defend spiritual experience as a source of knowledge, keeping in mind people like critics and skeptics like T.H. Huxley. There were others, like W.K. Clifford as well, who was a mathematician and philosopher at Cambridge University. And at the same time, from a philosophical standpoint, there were a number of 18th and 19th century philosophers whom Swami Vivekananda had studied, who also doubted the possibility that we can know God or experience God directly. Who are some of these people? Immanuel Kant is one of the most famous, the great German philosopher. He said that we can only know sense objects because of the limitations of our minds. The human cognitive intellect is basically limited in fundamental ways. So even if God exists, we can never know God. Even if we have an eternal soul separate from this body, we can never know whether we have a soul or not. And then Kant will say, but we should have faith in God and the soul anyway. But this is very controversial. How does he justify faith when he insists that we can't know God? It's very complicated. In any case, some of his followers, one of them, whom Swamiji mentions as well, is Herbert Spencer. And Spencer also, like a good Kantian, says that we should believe in God, but on faith. But God is the unknowable with a capital U. This was Spencer's big thesis, which became very famous at the time. So Swami Vivekananda himself mentions Spencer's doctrine of the unknowable. We can never know God. This is very common at that time. It was in the air. And so Swamiji was aware of this and trying to respond to it. How did he respond to these kinds of criticisms of spiritual experience? That's what I want to explain briefly in this lecture today. What I claim, and what I think that no scholar has even been aware of, Ram Bachchan, C. Mackenzie Brown, and many others, is that in Raja Yoga especially, but in other lectures as well, Swami Vivekananda presents a sophisticated philosophical argument defending spiritual experience as a source of knowledge. He defends this on the basis of two main principles, and because it gets slightly technical, that's why I wanted to put it on a few slides. So, okay, first principle is the principle of what I call perceptual proof. This is how Swami Vivekananda explains the principle. What is the proof of God? Direct perception, pratyaksha. The Sanskrit term for perception is pratyaksha. That's used by all the traditional Indian philosophers. The proof of this wall is that I perceive it. God has been perceived that way by thousands before and will be perceived by all who want to perceive him. But this perception is no sense perception at all. It is supersensuous, superconscious. It's a short passage, but it's packed with it's doing a lot of philosophical work, which I think can be easily overlooked. And so I want to try to unpack this passage slowly. I think what Swami Vivekananda is doing is he's imagining a skeptic, asking this question, well, what's the proof of God? Asking one of us, for instance, who believe in God or the soul, what's your proof that God exists? And what will we say? The mystic will say, imagine that I'm a mystic just for the moment. So I think I've realized God. So then I can say, because I've directly experienced God, that's why I believe in God. Then the dialectic continues. The skeptic has an answer, as I already mentioned. How do you know that your experience of God is not a subjective hallucination, right? This is where Swami Vivekananda's argumentation becomes so important. He makes a brilliant move here from a philosophical standpoint. He turns the tables on the skeptic here and says, oh, that's what you're asking? What's your proof that this wall exists? That's how he begins. What will the skeptic say? Well, because I see the wall. And then Swamiji will say, that's my proof that God exists, because I perceive God. What's the difference between you believing that the wall exists because you perceive the wall and me believing that God exists because I perceive God? Okay, so Swamiji is saying, if I am justified in believing that there's a wall in front of me because I perceive the wall, I'm equally justified in believing that God exists because I perceive God, assuming I'm a mystic again, which is not the case. Now, what's the logic? What's the principle that he's articulating here? We ordinarily take our sense perceptions to be proof that what we perceive actually exists. This is a very, very common practice. As Swamiji puts it, the proof of this wall is that I perceive it. And he says this everyday behavior, which all of us accept. You couldn't have come here today unless you accepted this principle, because you have to believe that you have a car, or that you believe in a bus that took you here. You have to believe that there are pews here that you're sitting on. You have to believe that I exist. All of this is based on sense perception. So he says that this everyday behavior is justified on the basis of the following general principle. Whatever we see and feel is proof if there has been nothing to delude the senses. This is the general principle. Whatever we see and feel is proof if there has been nothing to delude the senses. Okay? Let's call this the principle of perceptual proof. This is not his language, but just to give it a name to make it easier for us. The principle of perceptual proof, abbreviated PP, perceptual proof. And putting it in a slightly more technical language, this is what I take the principle to amount to. In the absence of reasons for doubting the reality of what I perceive, my perception of some entity X, whatever that entity is, it could be a dog, it could be a wall, it could be God, makes it reasonable for me to believe that X exists. In the absence of reasons for doubting the reality of what I perceive, my perception of some entity X makes it reasonable for me to believe that X exists. This might seem like so commonsensical that we don't even have to, well, it's obvious, isn't it? It is obvious, but sometimes we need to go to the kind of the bedrock assumptions that inform our common sense. And this is one of them, something that we accept this principle all the time. Most of us aren't aware of the fact that we accept this principle, but this is something we do. As I said, we couldn't have all assembled here today unless we believed this principle. We can't get up in the morning. If we wake up by alarm, how do we wake up? We hear the alarm. We have to take that to be an actual veridical perception of the alarm. How do we get out of the bed? We have to believe that there's a bed and that we can get out of it, that there's a floor under us. All of this is based on sense perception. All of that is based on this principle. Okay. And then there might be one other question. What about this first clause? In the absence of reasons for doubting the reality of what I perceive. Why is that important? Well, let's imagine that I just ingested psychedelic mushrooms. And then I perceive this laptop as vibrating and moving, swirling around in front of me. Should I accept that perception? Should I believe that the laptop is actually like, moving around, maybe talking to me? No. The reason is because I know that I just took magic mushrooms, right, an hour ago, and that this is very likely a hallucination, right? So if you can rule out those possibilities that you're hallucinating an experience because of drugs or that you're mentally unbalanced or something like that, then the default assumption is that whatever we perceive is good evidence that what we perceive actually exists. That's the basic idea. Now, well, actually, before we get to principle 2, I want to mention something. Those of you in the audience who have studied some philosophy might say, well, or even if you haven't, if you just are a critical thinker, you might say, well, the skeptic has an answer to this ready to hand. The answer is that there's a crucial asymmetry between sense perceptions on the one hand and spiritual experiences on the other. What's the asymmetry? Let's take Vivekananda's own example of the wall. The skeptic will say, I know the wall exists because I perceive it, but it's not just me saying that. Somebody else can come and verify that there's also a wall in the place where I claim to see it. My perception of the wall can be cross-checked. That's the language, the technical language. Anybody can cross-check any sense perception. all of you can also tell me whether there's a wall there, right? And what the color of the wall is. If I think it's red, you can correct me and say that it's not red. And what the skeptic will say is that spiritual experiences cannot be cross-checked in that way. So there's a crucial asymmetry, therefore the argument fails. Spiritual experience, therefore, should not be accepted as a source of knowledge. It's merely subjective, because it's not open to the kind of cross-checking procedures that ordinary sense perceptions are subject to. So now, how can we defend Swami Vivekananda's views against this, what's called the cross-checkability objection? I think there are four main responses. I go into much more detail in my book, but I'm just giving you a kind of an overview here. First of all, what he'll say to the skeptic, what he could say, is the following. Well, you said that somebody else can come and cross-check your perception. Who is that person? Well, the person I'm seeing right in front of me. That person, whoever the cross-checker is also in that person's visual field. So the problem is, let me give you an example to make this clear. Imagine I'm dreaming, but I'm not lucidly dreaming, so I don't know I'm in a dream. And then I see a tree in my dream. And I wonder, am I dreaming the tree, or is this a real tree? A dream person comes along, and I ask the dream person, is it a real tree? And they say, of course it is. I see it just as much as you do. But what happens? 2 hours later, I wake up from the dream, and I realize that not only was the tree a dream, the cross-checker was also part of my dream. There's the same problem. There's no non-circular way of cross-checking even sense perceptions. You can't come up with a single non-circular way of cross-checking even my perception of this wall, my perception of you guys in front of me. Nonetheless, none of us are crazy, and we all accept that our sense perceptions are good evidence that those things that we're perceiving actually exist. But if we accept that principle, then we're equally justified, mystics are equally justified, in taking their perceptions of supersensuous realities to be evidence that supersensuous realities exist. That's the idea. So that's the first response to this cross-checkability objection. But there are others. Because great mystics have claimed, including Swami Vivekananda, that there are ways that we can cross-check mystical experiences. There are a few. They're not exactly the same as ways that we can cross-check this wall, but they're similar, and similar enough to count as genuine cross-checking procedures. What are some of them? One, this is something that Swami Vivekananda emphasizes again and again. You should never just dogmatically accept what anybody says, including the great saints. What these saints say universally is, if you follow my instructions, if you do what I did, then you will realize God as well. I don't have a monopoly on God realization. Anybody can realize God if you follow these procedures. What are the procedures? Jesus, for instance, said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." You have to purify your heart. It's not very easy. It's not as easy as mixing chemicals together and then, seeing whether something results. But it can be done. And just because it's not an easy cross-checking procedure doesn't make it invalid as a cross-checking procedure. It's very difficult and may take many lives, but nonetheless, you can cross-check another person's mystical claims by doing what that saint has done. You have to renounce worldly attachments, worldly pleasures. You have to do all sorts of spiritual practices, and then, voila, God realization should result, right? So that's a kind of cross-checking. Another kind of cross-check. So this is a third response. This is another thing that Swami Vivekananda emphasizes again and again. He would say, I'll quote him directly. He says, when a man goes into samadhi, which is a very high state of spiritual experience, if he goes into it a fool, he comes out a sage. When a man goes into samadhi, or a woman, and this is old 19th century language, when a man goes into samadhi, if he goes into it a fool, he comes out a sage. What does it mean? It means if somebody tells us, I've realized God, one cross-check will be, let's see how this person lives on a day-to-day basis. Does this person behave like a saintly person? Does that person have the same kind of emotional reactions that we are subject to who have not had the privilege of realizing God? And if we find that they're behaving exactly in the same way with all the same petty grievances and anger and then we can, that's one piece of evidence that they may not be truthful. So that's another kind of cross-check that we can do even on claims about spiritual experience. Of course, these are not foolproof, but neither, as I pointed out, neither are the foolproof, or neither are the cross-checks for sense perceptions. And in fact, there are some saints who kind of like want to go under the radar, and so they pretend that they're very ordinary in order to hide themselves. So that's possible, but nonetheless, this is one of the many cross-checks that we can employ. But I also wanted to mention, this is something that's less obvious, but I think it's absolutely fascinating. Another kind of direct cross-check of a mystical experience. I discussed this in my previous book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. During Sri Ramakrishna's period of spiritual practice, a great monk and devotee of Ramlal, who was the child form of Rama, his name was Jatadhari, he came to visit Sri Ramakrishna, and he was staying there for some time. And he had this sort of small statue of Ramlal, but for Jatadhari, it was living. It was a living presence. And he would tend to this Ramlal as his own child. And he would play with Ramlal. And the interesting thing is, Sri Ramakrishna would see Ramlal exactly in the way that Jatadhari would also see. Both of them, who are highly evolved, these are people with realization. Both of them are playing with Ramlal together. And at the culmination of the story, what happens? Ramlal likes Sri Ramakrishna so much that he leaves Jatadhari for Ramakrishna and says, I want to stay with you. But in any case, the point is, this is a really interesting, I haven't come across another case like this where two highly advanced mystics cross-check each other's mystical experiences, spiritual experiences, by recognizing the same spiritual reality, right? Ramlal is moving in the same way, joking in the same way, doing the same things for both of these mystics, right? So this is very unusual, but I think that's also worth taking into account. Now, we get to, so as I said, Swami Vivekananda defends spiritual experience as a source of knowledge on the basis of two principles. I've now just explained the first principle, the principle of perceptual proof. I now want to get to the second principle. This is what I call his principle of testimonial proof, abbreviated as TP. Here's where he talks about it. This is from his book, Raja Yoga. Apta Vakya, the direct evidence of the yogis, of those who have seen the truth. His, meaning the yogi's, words are proof because he sees knowledge in himself. These yogis, for instance, are the authors of the sacred scriptures. Therefore, the scriptures are proof. If any such persons are living now, their words will be proof. So, let's unpack this passage because there's a lot here as well from a philosophical standpoint. The testimony of what he calls an apta, this is a standard term in Sanskrit philosophy. It means a credible testifier, somebody who we can take, whose testimony we can trust. The testimony of an apta about her perception of some entity X constitutes proof for others that X exists. If somebody who's credible tells me that they have perceived something, it's reasonable for me to believe in that something based on that person's testimony. Let's call this Swamiji's principle of testimonial proof, as I said, TP. And in slightly more technical language, we can put it this way. It is reasonable for me to accept the perceptual testimony of another person so long as I have no good reason to think that that person is untrustworthy. Again, why this latter clause, so long as I have no good reason to think that that person is untrustworthy? Because that's important. These two principles are not principles of gullibility, that you should believe just in anything that anybody tells us or that we should believe in any of our own experiences. Not that. If we can rule out that this testifier is untrustworthy, either because that person is prone to lying or because the person is crazy, for instance. If either of those things is true, then we have good reason not to accept the testimony. But if we can rule out those possibilities, then we should just, the default assumption is that the testifier is credible, and it's reasonable for us to accept their perceptual testimony. Again, you might ask, why should we accept this principle, TP, the principle of testimonial proof? Again, because we couldn't live without it. Almost everything we do is based on testimonial evidence, on perceptual testimony. To give you just a simple example, but these examples can be multiplied. When you go to school, what do you read? You read textbooks. Textbooks are full of perceptual testimony. You don't necessarily see everything yourself, but you take it on the authority of whoever's writing the textbook. What about another example? I go to a new town. I'm not familiar with it. I'm trying to get to the nearest grocery store. I find somebody who seems like a local, and I ask that person for directions. How do I get to the nearest grocery store? That person will say, well, you go down the road, you take a left, you take a right, and then you'll see the grocery store. What do? Do you run a background check on that person first and say, well, how do I know that he's not lying to me? No, the default assumption is that they're not lying to you, and then you trust them, and on that basis, you've left, right, and you arrive at the grocery store. And this is how most of us function, right? It's almost impossible not to function without accepting this principle as well. So both the principle of perceptual proof, PP, and the principle of testimonial proof are just principles that we accept all the time, even if we're not aware that we're accepting them. But once we make them explicit, we have to accept them. Even the skeptic has to accept. Even the skeptic about spiritual experiences has to accept these principles. Otherwise, the skeptic couldn't debate with the person who believes in spiritual experience in the first place. Because a debate presupposes that there's another person that I'm perceiving in front of me, we're both speaking in an intelligible language, that when he's speaking, I'm perceiving his words, and that I can make sense of those words, that he's actually saying something to me, that I can argue with him, right? So the skeptic himself or herself also accepts both of these principles. Now, we can finally get back to Ram Bachchan's, as I said, thoughtful criticisms of Swami Vivekananda's views on spiritual experience. To give you a little bit more of a concrete understanding of Ram Bachchan's criticism, I gave a direct quotation. This is from his 1994 book. He says, I have referred from time to time in this discussion to Vivekananda's attempts to equate the gain and verification of knowledge through Raja Yoga with the methods employed in science. The grounds, however, on which he draws his parallels leave many questions unanswered. Vivekananda's analogy with science is basically an analogy between religious experience and sense perception. The assumption is that both are verifiable in the same way. I'm going to repeat that because this is important for what follows. The assumption, he's saying that this is what Swami Vivekananda assumes, is that both religious experience and sense perception are verifiable in the same way. Almost all his examples, as well as his terminology, are drawn from the world of sense perception. There appear, however, to be very important differences between sensory experience and religious experience. Now, I think this is the second to last slide. So, I'm trying to get to it. There we go. Okay, so what is Ram Bachchan's criticism? If you read the whole chapter, you'll have a sort of better understanding, but I'm just going to summarize the main thing. He's saying that, Ram Bachchan is saying that Vivekananda argues for the scientific status of religion by establishing parallels between religious experience and sense experience. And he's saying that Vivekananda assumes that sense perceptions, which are the basis of science, and spiritual experiences can be verified in the same way. And he's saying that's obviously wrong. Why? Ram Bachchan gives a bunch of examples, but he brings in the same example that I gave you earlier, which is that, well, because my perception of the wall can be cross-checked, whereas your so-called spiritual experiences can't be cross-checked in that way. So therefore, Vivekananda is wrong in thinking of religion as a science because he has not explained how spiritual experience can be a source of knowledge, because it can't be cross-checked. So first of all, I've already discussed 4 lines of response to this cross-checkability objection, so I'm not going to rehearse those again. But I wanted to point out 2 much more fundamental mistakes that I think Ram Bachchan makes. First of all, as I said, that crucial sentence, the assumption is that both are verifiable in the same way. He's attributing to Swami Vivekananda the claim that religious experiences, spiritual experiences, can be verified in the same way that sense perceptions can be verified. And I would argue that he never says that anywhere. And in fact, that he says the opposite. So this is what Swamiji says. This is also taken from Raja Yoga. He says, the science of Raja Yoga proposes to put before humanity a practical and scientifically worked out method of reaching spiritual truth. He says this truth, but he means spiritual truth in this context. In the first place, every science must have its own method of investigation. This is the crucial sentence. And then he gives a nice example. He says, if you want to become an astronomer and sit down and cry, astronomy, astronomy, it will never come to you. The same with chemistry. A certain method must be followed. You must go to a laboratory, take different substances, mix them up, compound them, experiment with them, and out of that will come a knowledge of chemistry. If you want to be an astronomer, you must go to an observatory, take a telescope, study the stars and planets, and then you will become an astronomer. Each science must have its own methods. So Swami Vivekananda is explicitly saying that the science of religion will have its own methods, which are distinct from the methods of chemistry, the methods of astronomy. So the method of verifying religious claims will naturally be different from the method of verifying claims in biology or claims in chemistry. And even more fundamentally, the thing that Rambachan overlooks entirely is Vivekananda's defense of spiritual experience as a source of knowledge on the basis of these two principles that I've taken pains to explain. The principle of perceptual proof and the principle of testimonial proof. Nowhere does Rambachan acknowledge these principles, because it's easy to miss in a way. When you just read his lectures and study his writings, you can just it's easy to gloss over what he's doing, but there's a lot of profound philosophical work that's being done there, which I've tried to kind of unpack in this lecture in more detail in my book. But if you're aware of what he's doing philosophically, you have to take seriously these principles, and Rambachan nowhere even acknowledges that these principles exist. So that, to me, is the most fundamental problem with Rambachan's criticisms, that Vivekananda is not just establishing parallels between spiritual experience and sense experience. He's defending spiritual experience as a source of knowledge on the basis of these two principles, which he argues for. He doesn't just dogmatically assert them. Okay? Again, you might ask, how is all this relevant to us? In the Christian tradition, there's a concept called faith-seeking understanding. The idea is that we all have faith, but we're also trying to deepen our faith, strengthen our faith, and one of the ways that we can do that is by removing doubts that come up. Same thing in Vedanta. In one of the Upanishads, there's a threefold method: Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. You first listen to the scriptural teachings about God, about the soul. Then Manana, you reflect on those teachings. And part of that reflection involves removing doubts. So I hope that this whole lecture will help you to remove any doubts that might arise in the course of your spiritual practices, in the course of your struggles to realize God. So thank you. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. I think, okay.
We have a special event. I am very pleased, and as you can hear from my accent, there is a slight bias, so the fact that the book was published by Oxford University Press gives us a little bit more prestige in my mind. It also gets rid of some of the jargonese that one can sometimes find in books published by American universities. This is Swami Medhananda's latest book. It is kind of a hot seller. It's already out of stock in India, and his first two books we can't get in America or in India. So this is to say, move quickly. It is the philosophical foundations that are behind or form the foundation of Swami Vivekananda's pragmatic spiritual methods of spiritual practice. A little bit, if you are not familiar with Swami Vivekananda's teachings or life, this is probably not the first book you should start with. But for those people who have some knowledge of Swami Vivekananda's teachings and life, this book is very valuable. The Hindu tradition has always stressed, even the most devotional traditions, that the philosophical foundation to these ideas is important. And Ramakrishna Vedanta is no exception to that. Hindu tradition, the Vedanta tradition, has never expected you to check your brains in at the door and just go on faith. they expect you to use every aspect, your intellect, as well as your emotions and your actions, to get to the ultimate goal of life. And this book gives the philosophical foundation to these spiritual practices. It's very readable. I am not a philosophical mind at all, unlike Maharaj's here, but even I can understand it. And he touches on Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji's ideal of Advaita, and which, as you know, he feels is different from Shankara's, goes on to show how this manifests as a sacred universe, and showing that not just Swamiji's foundation of service, but also our current ideas of ecology, it becomes very relevant for that too. And so he goes then, of course, into the science, which he's discussed today, and ultimately into consciousness. So the book comes highly recommended. It's available from Vedanta Bookshop if you want to buy the book, and then Maharaj is going to do a book signing. And it comes with the Vedanta Bookshop seal of recommendation.
Couple announcements. On the 18th of February, we have Shivaratri starting at 6 p.m. and it goes quite late. And then the next day, the 19th, Swami Sarvadevanandaji, the head of the Hollywood Center, minister in charge, will be giving a lecture at the Sunday talk called Ramakrishna Shiva, I believe. Okay, thank you. And if anyone's interested, I'll be doing the book signing soon. I'll be greeting you guys outside now and then walk down to the bookstore. Thanks. I don't know how to turn this off. I'm not quite sure how to turn this off. Power button. Okay, thanks.